The first thing I saw when I turned the corner was orange cones. Lots of them. Then I saw the woman in the power suit standing in the middle of my road like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, looking ready for war. This was not how I'd planned to start my weekend. I just finished a brutal 60-hour work week as a construction foreman, my truck was loaded with groceries and beer, and all I wanted was to get to my cabin in the mountains and forget about the world for 2 days. Instead, I was staring at what looked like some kind of military checkpoint blocking the only road to my property. I rolled down my window as the woman marched toward my truck. She had short gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of expression that said she'd never met a rule she didn't love enforcing. "Excuse me," she announced, waving her clipboard like a weapon. "This is a private road. You cannot pass without proper authorization." I blinked at her. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake. This is the road to my cabin." "Not anymore," she said, consulting her clipboard with the enthusiasm of someone delivering an eviction notice. "I'm Margaret Stern, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. This entire area is now under our management, and we've implemented new access restrictions." She handed me a thick packet of papers titled, "New Community Access Guidelines." According to this masterpiece of bureaucratic nonsense, anyone wanting to use the road had to submit a formal application, undergo a background check, pay a $500 security deposit, and receive written permission from the HOA board. "This is insane," I said, flipping through the ridiculous requirements. "I own property up here. You can't just block public roads." Margaret's smile was the kind you see on people who really enjoy ruining someone else's day. "Actually, we can. This road was declared private property last month. We have every right to control access and ensure that only appropriate individuals are permitted in our exclusive community." Behind her, 2 men were setting up what looked like a permanent security checkpoint, complete with folding tables, chairs, and a sign reading "Authorized Personnel Only." "Look, lady," I said, trying to keep my temper in check, "I just want to get to my cabin. I've got frozen food in the back that's going to spoil." She shrugged like my problems were about as important to her as yesterday's weather. "Perhaps you should have planned better. You'll need to submit your application through proper channels. We'll review it within 10 to 14 business days." 2 weeks. I practically shouted. "For what? To drive on a road I've been using for 3 years? Rules are rules," she said smugly. That's when I noticed the fancy cars parked behind the checkpoint, Mercedes, BMWs, a couple of Audis. Clearly, some people were still getting through just fine. "What about them?" I asked, pointing to a silver Lexus that was pulling up to the checkpoint. "HOA members and approved residents," Margaret explained, waving the Lexus through without even checking an ID. "They have permanent access privileges." I sat there gripping my steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 5 minutes, I'd gone from looking forward to a peaceful weekend to being told I couldn't access my own damn property by some self-appointed road queen. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth. "I'll fill out your paperwork. But I'm coming back tomorrow and this better be sorted out." Margaret made a note on her clipboard, looking pleased with herself. "We look forward to reviewing your application, Mr. Davis." "Tom Davis." "Mr. Davis. Have a wonderful evening." As I drove back down the mountain, one thought kept running through my head. Who the hell did this woman think she was? I was about to find out the answer was a lot more complicated than I expected. That night, I called my brother-in-law Rick, who happened to be a real estate attorney in Denver. If anyone would know whether this HOA nonsense was legal, it would be him. "Tom," he said after I explained the situation, "this doesn't smell right. You can't just declare a public road private overnight. There are legal processes, public hearings, municipal approvals. Something's fishy here." "So what do I do?" "Send me everything you've got on your property, deed, survey, title, insurance, the works. Also send me this HOA paperwork. I want to see what legal basis they're claiming for this road grab." I spent the next hour scanning documents and emailing them to Rick. While I waited for his analysis, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. My cabin wasn't in some fancy development. It was a simple 2-bedroom log house on 5 acres that I'd bought 3 years ago from an old-timer named Pete Morrison. Pete's family had owned the land since the 1940s, and he'd sold it to me because he was getting too old to maintain the place. The cabin sat about a mile past the bridge over Miller's Creek, the same stone bridge that Margaret's checkpoint was now blocking. Without that bridge, there was literally no way to reach my property except by helicopter. Which got me thinking about the bridge itself. I'd always assumed it was just part of the public road system, but now that I thought about it, the bridge was pretty old. Solid granite construction, probably built in the 1920s or 1930s. It looked more like something a private company would have built than a government project. The next morning, Rick called with preliminary findings. Tom, I've got good news and weird news. The good news is that this HOA's claim to the road is complete bullshit. They filed paperwork with the county claiming ownership, but they have zero legal basis for it. And the weird news? The weird news is that I can't find any clear ownership records for the bridge itself. The road is definitely public property maintained by the county, but the bridge ownership is unclear. What does that mean? It means we need to do some digging. Can you get back up there and take a closer look at that bridge? Sometimes old infrastructure has plaques or markers that might give us clues about who built it. Monday morning, I took a personal day and drove back up to Miller's Creek. Margaret's checkpoint was manned by one of her security guys, but I didn't approach it. Instead, I parked about a quarter-mile down the road and hiked through the woods to get a closer look at the bridge. The bridge was even more impressive up close than I'd realized. Solid granite blocks, expert masonry work, built to last centuries. This wasn't some quick county road project. This was serious engineering. I walked around both sides of the bridge, looking for any kind of identification markers. On the downstream side, almost hidden by moss and decades of weather, I found what I was looking for. A small bronze plaque, green with age, mounted right into the stone. I scraped away the moss and read the inscription, Miller's Creek Bridge, constructed 1923, property of Davis Mining Company. Davis Mining Company. My great-grandfather's company. I stood there staring at that plaque for about 10 minutes, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. My great-grandfather had been in the mining business back in the 1920s and 1930s, but I'd never known much about his operations. After he died, my grandfather had sold off most of the mining properties and moved into other businesses. But apparently he hadn't sold everything. I pulled out my phone and called Rick immediately. Rick, you're not going to believe this. There's a plaque on the bridge saying it was built by Davis Mining Company. That was my great-grandfather's outfit. Holy shit, Tom, Rick said, and I could hear him getting excited. Do you have any records from your great-grandfather's business? Any old deeds or property documents? Maybe. My dad kept a bunch of his father's papers in the basement. I never really looked through them because I figured it was all ancient history. It might not be ancient history anymore. Those papers could be worth their weight in gold. Get over there and start digging. My dad had passed away 2 years earlier, but I still had keys to his house. That evening, I spent 4 hours in his basement, going through dusty boxes of documents that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Most of it was routine business paperwork from the 1920s and 1930s, mining permits, equipment purchases, payroll records, tax filings. But in the third box I struck gold. There it was, a property deed dated September 15, 1923, transferring ownership of Miller's Creek Bridge and associated easements from the state of Colorado to Davis Mining Company. The purchase price was $500, and in exchange the company agreed to maintain the bridge for public use in perpetuity. The deed specifically stated that Davis Mining Company and its heirs and successors would own the bridge forever, with the responsibility of keeping it open for public access. But that wasn't all. I kept digging and found maintenance records showing my great-grandfather had spent thousands of dollars over the years repairing and upgrading the bridge. There were letters to and from the county about road maintenance responsibilities, insurance documents, and even some old black and white photographs of the bridge under construction. The final piece of the puzzle was my great-grandfather's will, which left all mining properties, including infrastructure and easements, to his son, my grandfather. My grandfather's will passed everything to my father, and my father's will left everything to me. According to these documents, I was the legal owner of Miller's Creek Bridge, the only bridge providing access to Whispering Pines. I called Rick at 11 p.m., too excited to wait until morning. Tom, he said after I'd walked him through what I'd found, if these documents are legitimate, and they look legitimate, you don't just own a bridge. You own the choke point that controls access to an entire community. So what does that mean legally? It means Margaret Stern just fucked with the wrong guy. Rick spent the next 3 days verifying the documents with the county recorder's office, the state archives, and a couple of historical research firms that specialized in early 20th century mining operations. Every single document checked out. Not only was I the legitimate owner of Miller's Creek Bridge, but there was no record of the ownership ever being transferred to anyone else. The bridge had been in my family for almost a century, and nobody had bothered to check the ownership records when they started building houses on the other side of it. Tom, Rick explained over lunch at a diner in Denver, here's what we're dealing with. That HOA has been acting like they own something they don't own, while you actually own the one piece of infrastructure that makes their whole community accessible. So I can legally control who crosses the bridge? You can legally control everything about that bridge. Who crosses it, when they cross it, what they pay to cross it, everything. Colorado law is very clear about private property rights. And the HOA's road ownership claim? Complete horseshit. They filed false documents with the county. That's actually a crime, by the way. I sat there eating my burger and thinking about Margaret Stern's smug face when she told me to submit an application and wait 2 weeks for approval. Rick, I said finally, I think it's time to have some fun with this. The following Friday, I drove back up to Miller's Creek with a truck full of supplies. Rick came with me along with my buddy Steve from work, who'd volunteered to help after hearing the story. We parked right next to the bridge and started unloading folding tables, chairs, a large professional-looking sign, a metal cash box and a laptop computer. Within 10 minutes, Margaret came storming over from her checkpoint. "Mr. Davis," she called out, marching toward us with her clipboard clutched to her chest. "You cannot set up here without authorization. This is private property." "You're absolutely right, Margaret," I said, setting up my sign with a big smile. "This is private property." The sign read, Miller's Creek Bridge, private property, access by permit only, owner, Thomas Davis, St. 1923. Her face went white as she read it. What is this supposed to mean?" Rick stepped forward and handed her a thick folder. "Miss Stern, I'm Rick Martinez, Mr. Davis's attorney. These documents prove that my client owns this bridge and has full legal authority to control access across it." Margaret opened the folder and started flipping through pages. The original 1923 deed, county authentication letters, property surveys, historical research reports, and a legal opinion confirming my ownership rights. This can't be right," she stammered. "We've done extensive research on property ownership in this area." "Apparently not extensive enough," Rick said cheerfully. I finished setting up my table and sat down in my folding chair. "So here's how this is going to work, Margaret. Since you folks seem to love access control and authorization procedures, I've decided to implement some of my own." I pulled out a laminated sheet, my own version of her community access guidelines. "Anyone wanting to cross my bridge needs to submit an application, pay a $75 access fee and receive written permission from me personally. I'll be here every Friday evening and Saturday morning to process applications." Margaret's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. You can't do this." "Actually he can," Rick said, pulling out yet another document. "Colorado private property law is very clear. Mr. Davis has absolute authority to control access to his bridge. But people live up there. They need to get to their homes." I shrugged. Maybe they should have thought about that before they started blocking my access to my cabin. That's when the guy from her checkpoint came running over, looking panicked. "Mrs. Stern, there are about 30 cars backed up at our station, and they're all asking what's going on with the bridge." Margaret looked back and forth between me and the growing line of cars, panic starting to creep into her voice. "This is extortion." "No," Rick corrected calmly, "this is property rights. The same property rights you claim to be exercising, except Mr. Davis actually has legal standing." By 4 p.m., I had a line of 25 people waiting to fill out bridge access applications. Word had spread quickly through Whispering Pines that the bridge was under new management. The first few applicants were reasonable folks, year-round residents who just wanted to get home and were willing to pay the fee. I approved their applications immediately and gave them weekend passes. But then things got interesting. A red-faced man in an expensive polo shirt stormed up to my table. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "I'm not paying some construction worker to cross a public bridge. It's a private bridge," I replied calmly, "and I'm the owner. You're welcome to find another route if you prefer." "There is no other route." "Then I guess you'll need to decide how badly you want to get home." He ended up paying the fee, but not before calling me several creative names. Next came a woman with 2 kids in the back seat of her minivan. "Please," she said, "my children need to get home for dinner." "This is crazy." I looked at the kids. They were maybe 8 and 10 years old, looking confused and tired. "Family emergency access is free," I said, waving her through. "But next time, make sure your HOA checks property ownership before they start blocking roads." The pattern continued all evening. Reasonable people got reasonable treatment. Jerks got strict adherence to the rules. Around 6 p.m., Margaret returned with reinforcements. A tall man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Stuart Graves, the HOA's legal counsel. Mr. Davis, Stewart said, trying to sound authoritative, this bridge access scheme is illegal. You cannot charge fees for access to a public road. The road is public, Rick replied, appearing at my side with a coffee. The bridge is private. No bridge, no road access. Pretty simple concept. Stewart pulled out his own folder of documents. We've researched this extensively. There's no record of private bridge ownership. Then you researched wrong, I said, handing him a copy of my authenticated deed. Feel free to double-check with the county recorder's office. What happened next was beautiful to watch. Stewart spent 20 minutes on his phone, calling various offices and checking records. With each call, his confident expression faded a little more. Finally, he hung up and turned to Margaret with a grim expression. The documents appeared to be legitimate. Margaret looked like she was about to have a stroke. So what do? We negotiate, Stewart said quietly. Okay, I said, leaning back in my chair and enjoying the moment. I'm willing to negotiate. But first, I want to understand something. I looked directly at Margaret. Why did you block my access to my cabin? She fidgeted with her clipboard. We were protecting the community's privacy and security. From me? A guy who owns a cabin and minds his own business. We have standards, she said defensively. Not everyone is suitable for our community. I see. And who decides who's suitable? The HOA board, of course. I nodded thoughtfully. Well, now I have standards too. And I've decided that not everyone is suitable for crossing my bridge. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Since you folks appreciate proper procedures, I've developed a comprehensive application process for bridge access. Stewart's eyes widened as he saw the thickness of the application packet. What's all this? Oh, just some basic requirements, I said, flipping through the pages. Personal background check, 3 character references, financial disclosure, a written essay explaining why the applicant deserves bridge access, and a $500 security deposit. Margaret's face turned red. This is exactly what we required from you. I know. I thought it was such a good system, I decided to adopt it myself. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? But you can't require all this just to cross a bridge. Why not? You required it just to use a road. Rick was trying hard not to laugh. Mr. Davis has also implemented a review timeline of 10 to 14 business days for each application. 2 weeks. Stewart protested. People need to get to their homes. Maybe they should have planned better, I said, echoing Margaret's exact words from the week before. The line of cars behind us was now stretching back around the curve in the road. Several people had gotten out and were walking over to see what was happening. Look, Stewart said, lowering his voice, what do you actually want here? Money? We can work something out. I don't want your money, I said. I want 3 things. First, I want my cabin access restored with a guarantee that this harassment won't happen again. Second, I want a formal public apology from your HOA for the illegal road blockade. Third, I want Margaret here to personally process my bridge access application using her own requirements. Margaret started to object, but Stewart held up his hand. That seems reasonable. Oh, and one more thing, I added. I want it acknowledged in writing that I own this bridge and have full legal authority to control access to it. While we were negotiating, someone had called the local TV news. A crew from Channel 7 showed up just as Margaret was struggling through my bridge access application. The reporter, a sharp young woman named Jessica Chin, was fascinated by the story. So let me get this straight, she said to me while the camera rolled. The HOA blocked your access to your own property, not knowing that you own the only bridge that provides access to their entire community? That's exactly right, I said. They wanted to control who could use the road, but they forgot to check who actually owned the infrastructure that makes the road usable. She turned to Margaret, who was still hunched over my application. Miss Stern, how do you respond to claims that your HOA was operating without proper legal authority? Margaret looked up from the paperwork, clearly flustered. We were acting in good faith to protect our community's interests. But you were requiring people to pay fees and submit applications to use what you claimed was private property, when you didn't actually own that property? It was a misunderstanding, Stewart jumped in quickly. We're working to resolve the situation. The news story aired that evening and was picked up by several national outlets by the next morning. Social media was having a field day with the HOA bridge blockade, with most people enjoying the poetic justice of the situation. My favorite tweet read, HOA Karen learns that the construction worker she tried to bully actually owns the bridge to her whole neighborhood. You love to see it. By Monday morning, Stuart was calling Rick every 2 hours, desperate to work out a deal. The negative publicity was hurting property values in Whispering Pines, and several residents were threatening to sue the HOA for the embarrassment and inconvenience. We met Wednesday morning at Rick's law office in Denver, me, Rick, Margaret, Stuart, and 2 other HOA board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Stuart opened with what he probably thought was a generous offer. "Mr. Davis, we're prepared to offer you $15,000 to resolve this situation and restore normal bridge access." I laughed out loud. "You want to pay me to give up control of my own property? That's not how property rights work." "Then what do you want?" I'd had plenty of time to think about it. "Here's the deal. First, the HOA formally acknowledges that I own the bridge and have full legal authority to control access. Second, you issue a public apology for the illegal road blockade and acknowledge that you had no right to block my access. Third, you guarantee in writing that you'll never interfere with my property rights again." "And in exchange?" Margaret asked quietly. "In exchange, I'll grant permanent access easements to all current Whispering Pines residents so they can get to their homes without restriction. Future residents will need to apply to me for access rights, but I'll approve any reasonable request." Stuart looked confused. "That's it? You don't want money?" "I don't need your money. I want respect. I want acknowledgement that you can't just bully people because you don't like their truck or their job or their lifestyle." One of the other board members spoke up. "What about bridge maintenance? If you own it, are you responsible for upkeep?" I smiled. "Funny you should ask. According to the original 1923 agreement, the bridge owner is responsible for maintenance, but the costs are supposed to be shared proportionally by all users. So technically, Whispering Pines residents owe my family about 80 years of back maintenance fees." The room went dead silent. "How much are we talking about?" Stuart asked nervously. Rick consulted his notes. "With inflation and compound interest, approximately $240,000. Margaret made a strangled noise. "But," I continued, "I'm willing to waive all past fees in exchange for the HOA establishing a proper maintenance fund going forward. Let's say $300 per household per year, paid into an account that I control for bridge upkeep." The settlement agreement was signed the following Friday. Margaret issued a public apology that was posted on the HOA website, published in the local newspaper, and read aloud at the next community meeting. The fake checkpoint was dismantled, normal traffic flow was restored, and I granted permanent access easements to all current residents. The HOA agreed to establish an annual bridge maintenance fund, and they included a good neighbor clause that prohibited them from interfering with my property rights or access to my cabin. But the story had some delicious additional consequences. It turned out that Margaret's overzealous enforcement had created legal problems beyond just my situation. Once residents started researching property rights and questioning HOA authority, they discovered that the association had been collecting fees and imposing fines in other areas without proper legal basis. A class action lawsuit was filed within 3 months, seeking refunds of thousands of dollars in illegitimate fines and fees. Margaret was voted out as HOA president at the next election and replaced by someone with a more reasonable approach to community management. Stuart's law firm quietly dropped the Whispering Pines HOA as a client after the negative publicity. Several residents thanked me personally for standing up to the bullying, saying that Margaret had been making life miserable for anyone who didn't fit her vision of the perfect suburban resident. 6 months after the settlement, I was sitting on my cabin deck on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee and enjoying the mountain sunrise. The peace was perfect, no roadblocks, no checkpoints, no Margaret. Around 9 a.m. I heard a car coming up the road. A pickup truck pulled into my driveway and an older man got out. "Mr. Davis?" he called out. "I'm Bill Harrison. I live about 3 miles up the valley." I walked over to meet him. "What can I do for you, Bill?" He smiled and handed me an envelope. "I wanted to give you this personally." Inside was a handwritten note and a check for $1,000. The note read, "Thank you for standing up to those HOA bullies. Margaret Stern made life hell for a lot of us old-timers and we never knew how to fight back. Your bridge victory showed us that they could be beaten. This is from several of us who want to contribute to your bridge maintenance fund." Over the next few weeks, I received similar notes and contributions from other residents who'd been intimidated by Margaret's regime but hadn't known how to resist. It turned out that my victory had inspired other people to research their own property rights and challenge questionable HOA practices throughout the area. Today, Whispering Pines is a much more reasonable community. The new HOA leadership focuses on actual services like road maintenance and community events, rather than harassment and social engineering. Margaret? Last I heard, she'd moved to Arizona and was trying to get elected to a condo association board. I almost feel sorry for those Arizona residents. Almost. As for me, I still drive across my bridge every weekend to reach my cabin. But now there's a new bronze plaque next to the original 1923 marker. It reads, Miller's Creek Bridge, owned and maintained by the Davis family since 1923, a reminder that bullies should always check the property records before they start throwing their weight around. Every time I cross that bridge, I think about my great-grandfather, who had the foresight to secure legal ownership of a piece of infrastructure that would end up protecting his family's rights a century later. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting back at your enemies. Sometimes it's discovering that you had the power to stop them all along, you just didn't know it yet. And sometimes, the little guy with the beat-up truck and the blue-collar job turns out to own the one thing that the fancy people with their fancy cars can't live without. That's a pretty good feeling. The moral of the story: never assume that the person you're trying to push around doesn't have more power than you realize. Sometimes the construction worker owns the bridge.